Good afternoon and welcome to In the Cool of the Day. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Sharon Anderson, and this is your segment from Behind the Podium, Conversations about Law and Faith. As we celebrate the birthday and the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, and as we begin to enter into Black History Month, I wanted to kick off this season of From Behind the Podium with a provocative discussion of the faith and civil rights and legal issues surrounding our country. In the wake of the killing of Michael Brown, the shooting of the 12-year-old in Ohio, and the countless and senseless killings of Black men by the police in our country, the discussion remains relevant and important, and the intersection of law and faith issues should not be ignored. With me today, and I'm very, very excited and humbled to have Dr. E. Faye Williams, the chair and the president of the National Congress of Black Women. How are you, Faye?
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, this is exciting because, as you know, the issues remain relevant, the issues remain provocative, the issues remain important for us to continue to discuss. And I couldn't think of anybody better but you to come in and discuss with me how we can begin from not only a legal issue, but from a faith issue to address these issues. So I think the first thing I wanted to talk about was just your perception of the civil rights issues surrounding the killing of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. You know, why no grand jury indictment?
Well, as you know, the grand jury is a tool of the prosecutor. And when the prosecutor does not want to indict, the prosecutor does not indict. And so if it were a federal grand jury, we would see something like a 99% indictment. But because it's not a federal, grand jury, these people come into this grand jury room with nobody but the prosecutor to talk with them. There's no one there for the defense. There's no attorney helping the jurors understand what is going on. They're listening for days and days and days to nothing but the prosecutor, presenting only what that prosecutor wants them to hear. And that's usually something exonerating, particularly a policeman. Because it's very difficult, as you know, to get a policeman indicted for anything. And we know there's some great police officers.
Sure.
But of course, there are also some that are bad. I remember being in New York City, and I saw a police officer and simply asked him for directions. And I'm not beating up on New York City Police because I know there's some that are good. But I simply asked him for directions somewhere, which happened to be right in the neighborhood where he was. He just looked at me and said, "What do I look like? Do I look like a signpost?" And that was it. And so that was my impression for years of New York City police officers.
Sure.
And I'm sure in the case of Ferguson, and even in St. Louis County, we've gotten some very, very bad impressions of police officers there. And a lot of it had to do with that grand jury process. You have these people who don't know anything about the case generally, and they're only hearing one side of a story. That's the problem. They don't get the second set of the story. So they have nothing to do other than to judge what the prosecutor, who in many instances don't want there to be an indictment. And that's the way that prosecutor presents it. As you saw, the prosecutor in the Michael Brown situation came on with this big show, to show us all of what he had done. And of course, we could see through all of that.
Absolutely.
That was for a reason. That was trying to convince the public that he had done the right thing, when in fact we learned later that there were many errors made in that case. So that's what we see all around the country when the prosecutor doesn't want to indict someone.
So how do we address that? In your view, is the process broken? Is change of venue maybe an answer? Because clearly, with even the issues in Eric Garner, here the medical examiner ruled it a homicide. Now, I'm a former criminal defense attorney. I still do criminal defense. If a Black male is charged with murder and the autopsy says homicide, the indictment is going to be for a homicide and for a murder, whether it's first degree or second degree. So is it true that the grand jury is made up of the people in the locale where the crime happened? So a lot of times the result of the grand jury is due with the makeup of the grand jury.
Absolutely, that has something to do with it. So I think more than changing the laws, it's a matter of how those policies are carried out, how those laws are carried out. And you just pointed to one of them. In most instances, we find around the country, no matter where we are, that black and brown people are guilty, until proven innocent.
Absolutely.
The law does not say that,
That's
but
right.
that's the way our people are treated,
Yes.
that they are guilty. So they start out with this bad rap, and it's very, very challenging to get an indictment. So one of the things that Congressman Hank Johnson from Georgia has done is to introduce a Grand Jury Reform Act.
Wonderful.
And I would like to hope that people would sign that petition to encourage Congress to pass that law, because it certainly needs to be. And one of the things that's in that law is that grand juries would not be used on police officers, especially when there is a murder, someone dies in that situation, because we almost know that if it's involving a black or brown person, there will be no indictment.
Justice, no
Yes,
indictment.
no justice,
That's
no
right.
peace, no justice.
Right.
Yes, and that's why we've had young people all around this country demonstrating, protesting, because they could see,
It's
the
not
error
fair.
of that. They could see how wrong it is and how that prosecutor approached that case.
Absolutely.
And even though they went through all of these things methodically, but it was all against Michael Brown. So we
Yes.
could tell if they didn't indict him in the first few days, there was going to be no indictment, because they were trying to cover up errors.
Right.
And as we have found, they did cover up errors.
Absolutely.
And then the other thing is the defense lawyer. If the person were indicted, the defense lawyer doesn't always have access to that information.
don't.
It's a secret process,
That's
and
right.
that just sort of leads us to it and encourages prosecutorial misconduct.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
And bias. And bias.
Yes, of
and
course.
my understanding is that, of course, from the reports, that they demonized Michael Brown.
Absolutely.
And usually they don't do that in the
Yes.
grand jury process. They just bring in the facts. They don't. They don't
Absolutely.
try to bring out the background of the decedent and what happened to the decedent. So in a regular murder case, if let's say a woman was killed on the street by a robber, you don't hear anything about the victim.
Absolutely.
You only hear
that
things
person's
about
background.
yes.
Because the background has absolutely nothing to do with the case. In most instances, it's like the way we treat rape in this country. Sometimes we'll say, well, if she hadn't been dressed that way, if she
Right.
hadn't been out late at night, what
Exactly.
have you. But that's not an excuse. As my friend Dick Gregory always says, is she could walk down the street naked.
Right.
She should
Yes.
not be raped. I mean, no one
That's
has
right.
the right to rape a person
right.
or to injure a person in any way. And I think we do need some changes in the grand jury system, but more, we need some policies, the way that people accept these laws and the way they carry them out.
That's
Because
right.
the way we're doing it now, it just encourages prosecutorial misconduct. And I say misconduct, even though that's not the legal thing that they
Sure.
are calling it, but to me, that's what it is.
Sure.
If you are just giving one side of a story and you're allowing that prosecutor to say whatever he or she wishes to say and to do, even though it's against the person who now is dead
Yes.
and cannot speak for
Yes,
himself
and
or
cannot
herself.
speak. That's right. That's right. And then there's the racial profiling aspect of it from the law enforcement side.
Absolutely.
I mean, clearly there needs to be some policy changes there. Can you give us our views about police profiling and how that's been an issue in our country for quite a while,
Yes.
obviously. But what are your views
Yes.
on the
Well,
racial profiling?
Absolutely. That's a big issue in this country. We've always had that issue. We probably always will have the issue. Of course, I understand in about the next 20 or 25 years, white people who tend to be the ones who are doing the racial profiling will no longer be in a majority in this country. And I'm counting on black and brown people to be kinder and gentler
Yes.
to others when we are, a majority minority country, because I understand in 20 to 25 years we will be. That right now more babies are born in minority communities than they are in the majority communities. And we are taught, in our churches and otherwise, to be kind, to treat all human beings as human beings.
Absolutely.
And I would think that we would continue that teaching when we are in charge
Yes.
of law enforcement.
Yes.
So I have no doubt that one of these days, but it's going to be a long time away,
from now.
we're going to have a fairer justice system.
Absolutely. What do you think would help build trust between people of color and police officers that are white or of a different race? How do we begin to, I know clearly training is involved, and clearly having more people of color on the police force would help, but given that we know that that's a little far away from today, what would you suggest we begin to do to begin to rebuild that trust?
Well, you've pretty much given the answer. You're asking the question,
Right.
but you've pretty much given the answer. But I think the church plays a role in this.
Yes.
And one of the things I would like to see the church do is what many churches, and I say many because there were many churches that did not participate, and they were part of the problem during the civil rights movement.
That's right.
But I would like to see churches that, you know, churches have police officers in the churches. I'd like to see seminars there that talk about treating people as human beings, about fairness, about, you know, how we can get along, and also teaching police officers why there is this animosity in minority communities against police officers. It may not have anything to do with that individual member of the church, but it does have something to do with police officers in general and how they treat people. And our young people, black and brown people, and even adults, are in fear of police officers.
Absolutely.
And when people are in fear, when they're afraid, you can't very well talk with them. They're going to run away from you.
That's right.
You know, so what you do then is you bring on the stop and frisk, you know, rule. You see a young person who is just maybe looking down, and that's one of the things that police officers, as you know, often use as a reason to stop someone, or the person may run away because they simply don't want to be confronted by a police officer. They know they're going to be harassed by that police officer. They're going to be humiliated in many instances, so they just want to get out of the way. The last thing they want to see in their community is a police officer.
That's right.
So I think the church from time to time can have sermons about police community relations. And also I think the pastors who have very much influence in our communities can from time to time talk with those police chiefs, talk with those who are supposed to be responsible for community policing about what the general problems are in that community and what people expect. It shouldn't just be one way in terms of what the police department expects, but also the police officers need to know about all the the good people in those communities who never commit crimes. We're talking about a small amount of people.
Very small segment. That's correct. That's correct. We're going to take a break and come back and talk a little bit more about that. And I want to talk about the talk that we now have to have with our children, because the talk used to be about sex, but now it's about how to deal with police officers.
And I hope we'll do this, more about the stop and frisk too, and the problems that causes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back from behind the podium, conversations about law and faith with Dr. Faye E. Williams. Welcome back to From Behind the Podium. And with me is Dr. Faye Williams, and we're talking Ferguson, we're talking Eric Garner, we're talking police relations, we're talking civil rights, and we're talking the role of the church in beginning to mend some of the trauma that we've dealt with as the African American community with respect to the law enforcement process, the judicial process, and whether we really have justice for our people in the wake of some of these incidents that we've been experiencing. So before the break, break, Dr. Williams, we talked about the community policing.
Yes.
You told us how you think the church should be involved more. And what I have two young men as sons, two black men, and a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old. And now I realize I have to have a talk with them about how to handle themselves as young men. You talked about people being in the communities and running away from police because they're afraid of what the contact would result in, even if they didn't do anything wrong. So tell us about how we can and how our listeners might be able to begin to have this discussion with our youth, because it's dangerous.
Well, you know, the mayor of New York started a conversation on that, and I, for the life of me, cannot understand why some people got so angry with him. Even though he's a white man, he does have a black son.
That's right.
And that's because that's the way this nation describes young people. If they have mixed blood, black and white, they are said to be black, right?
That's right. That's
so
right.
it's normal. It's to be expected that a white father would talk about his black son in the way that the mayor did. So I'm glad he brought up that conversation.
Absolutely.
And I'm surprised that more people didn't come to his defense and say, all black parents practically have this conversation with their sons.
Yes.
And not because they think their children are going to do anything wrong.
Absolutely.
And they shouldn't have to have the discussion, but they do, because the system requires them to have it, to be careful so that their sons and their daughters sometimes now will not be injured, will not do anything that gives a police officer an excuse. And I'm coming from a family where my brother was a police officer. I have a nephew now down on the Mexico-Texas border.
Wow.
I have several cousins who, you know, are police officers.
So you're not police bashing.
I'm not police bashing, but I'm just saying that it's necessary for parents to do that before their sons and sometimes their daughters now go out, to be very careful, because we never know what policeman they're going to run into and what that person's reaction will be. They may not be patient. For instance, in the stop and frisk in New York that we've heard so much about, and that a judge ruled eventually that was a violation of constitutional rights.
Yes.
We often see that all across the country. We see
reasonable suspicion.
That's right.
And them justifying the contact.
How do we know what a police officer is going to consider reasonable suspicion?
That's right.
And it could be that the person turns away, that the person crosses the street, that the person turns around and goes the other way, or the person, you know, whatever. Those are not reasons. I mean, normal people do those kinds of things in our community who would never think of committing a crime.
Absolutely.
So we have to be very careful. First of all, stop and frisk presented a lot of problems. It was a violation in most instances of the Fourth Amendment, which is the search and seizure law.
Exactly.
And, you know, in law school we studied that one a lot, so we all know about that. That you've got to have a
probable
reasonable
cause.
Probable cause. Yes. And there isn't always probable cause. Just because 5 teenagers are riding in a car, or
with
they're
hoods
being
on.
or being a little loud. And so what did we do? Our response was for all of us to wear hoods when the police objected to that. Were we provoking the police? No, we were just saying this is not probable cause to shoot and kill a young black person or a young Latino person. So it's a constitutional violation also in terms of the 14th Amendment and equal rights. We know that there are a lot of young white kids. We've heard about them in New Hampshire. We've heard about them after football games, how they practically tear up a town. And they don't always get arrested. Absolutely. But our young people are stopped and frisked and arrested for far less than that. And you know, even though a lot of our young people are stopped and frisked, we're told that only about 10% of them actually were guilty of something. You know, they were charged with something. So if you're not, if the police officer is wrong 90% of the time, it seems like there is something wrong with that procedure. So we need to change that procedure wherever people are using stop and frisk.
Absolutely.
And we're told that more often than not, when white people are stopped and frisked, in the few times that it happens, 80% of them are
are guilty
are
of
guilty of
something.
something.
Wow.
Yes, it could be drugs, or it could be a gun, because
Yes.
most black kids don't walk around with guns.
No,
That's more
no.
likely something that white people are doing. And I'm not white people bashing. I'm just
right.
talking about what statistics tell us
The
about it.
statistics,
So it
yes.
just seems that, the profiling is wrong, and that's why so many young black and brown people are arrested, because there is a presumption of guilt. Yes.
Right, and that's not what our justice system is founded on or built on.
Exactly,
That's
exactly.
right. And so, as they say, is justice for just them,
Yes.
and not
Or
just
just
us.
us.
Right.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
So let's talk about how we can begin to address some of these things. You talked about the demonstrations. You talked about what was going on in New York, even when the mayor stood up and said, "I have a son."
Yes.
He just said, I have a son and I can relate. And then the police officers, quote unquote, protested and turned their backs on him,
Yes.
which in my view was a sign that they want to do what they want to do when they want to do it, because he didn't
Absolutely.
even condone the shooting of the police officers. He was not doing that. He was just saying that given everything that was happening in the country, he understood how the families of Michael Brown and Eric Garner felt,
Yes.
and the entire, well, I won't say the entire, but a very good number of police officers across the country took offense to that.
Yeah, well, that's where we have to start, is defending people who are saying the right things.
That's
Stand
right.
up for them, because often we don't do that. We let them hang out there all by themselves when they're making the very point that we want to make, but
Yes.
maybe we're too afraid to make it.
Yes.
I think also we have to, in our churches, again, talk about the situation.
Yes,
Sometimes we don't like to
yes.
talk about unpleasant situations.
That's
More families need to be talking about what goes on and how young people should behave. But again, we shouldn't teach them to behave or believe that something is wrong with them as to why you're giving them that lecture.
Exactly.
I mean, because then it makes it sound like our young people are so bad that, we all believe that they're bad. No. We're simply giving those discussions to keep them alive in many
Yes,
instances. And we shouldn't put it all on the young people, but we should make sure that our police officers, the police chiefs, the community police officers understand that they have some responsibilities too.
Absolutely.
And they should read some of the statistics about what they do and, admit that.
That they're wrong when they're
Absolutely.
wrong.
Absolutely.
We are not saying that all police officers are bad. We clearly know that. As you
Yes.
said, you have police
Yes.
officers in your family. I
Yes.
certainly have friends that are police officers in my family. Even as a public defender, I've met police officers,
Yes.
good people,
Yes.
coming from good homes, with good heads on their shoulders that understand the issues. But
And when we talk
for the
about black
few.
on black crime, that is a problem. That's problematic. So more of us need to get away from using that. Again, I go back to Dick Gregory.
Yes.
Who do we think killed Chinese in China?
Right.
Chinese
There you go.
people. Who kills most white people in white communities?
That's right.
People kill where they live.
Yes.
Now, do I want to excuse that in our community? Sure, we have some work to do in our community, but we shouldn't make our community feel like we're the culprits
That's
in
right.
everything. We need to, go about teaching our young people what they need to know to survive.
Yes.
And we also need to recognize the good in young people
Absolutely.
and be there with them and help them to become all that they can
That's
be.
right.
And I think that's the responsibility not only of the family, but also police officers. Police officers
Absolutely.
are there to protect and to serve, but people are not going to believe you're there to protect and to serve them when they continue to see Tamir Rice is shot down and
That's
Michael
right.
Brown shot down
Yes.
and and Eric Garner choked to death.
That's right.
Over minor things.
Minor things.
And
Cigarettes.
in most instances, they aren't even doing anything other than the case of Trayvon Martin
Yes.
going home.
Yes.
Jordan Davis sitting in his car playing music.
That's right,
These
that's
are
right.
trivial things. It's not like these young people were trying to
In
murder
drug-
someone
or in a drug deal
yes,
or something. Yes,
Absolutely.
absolutely,
Absolutely. So
absolutely.
we need to teach police their responsibilities as well as keeping our young people
Yes.
doing what they should be doing and
That's
not
right.
just doing things to aggravate a police officer, for example. I mean, which is still not an excuse for murdering
That's
a young
right. It's
person.
not.
But at the
It's
same
not.
time, we don't want the public to begin to feel that just because the young person said or did something, like in the case of Michael Brown, he and his friend were walking down the street. That's
Exactly.
all.
That's
doing
it.
absolutely
That's it.
nothing that called for shooting him to death. Even if Michael Brown was at his car, at the police officer's car, there was still no excuse. I mean,
Right.
there was no reasonable cause that Michael had a gun
That's right.
or Michael had anything dangerous
right.
to harm that police officer. The police officer could have just backed out of there if he thought that.
Exactly,
you know?
exactly.
I just could never understand that.
And my understanding is that they're taught to shoot center mass.
Yes.
So if you, even if you see someone reach, it seems to me the answer is not to kill them. You know,
Exactly.
shoot someone in the arm, shoot someone in the leg,
Yes.
even the 12-year-old. You know, it was apparent just from even looking at the
That was
video
a
that it
little
was a
person.
little person.
Yes,
So even getting out, hiding behind the car and saying, "Put the gun down, son."
Right, yeah. There was no warning
there was
in the
not
case of
even a
Tamir
warning.
Rice.
That's
Nothing,
right,
absolutely
that's right.
nothing.
And so again, I think you're right. You know, we used to see more of boys and girls clubs and more interaction between the community and our minority youth and the police. But without that interaction, it helps both sides feed on stereotypes that now have become totally dangerous, and our young men and even women are
And, you know,
dying because of it.
Yeah, we can just look at our Congress and all of the mean things that they do to one another there. They're supposed to be our leaders, and yet they exhibit this meanness every day, even toward the president, the man who is the leader of the free world. They have absolutely no respect for him. And so we need to check ourselves, even as adults, and lead our young people where they need to go. We can't do that if we're not doing it ourselves.
That's such a great point. That's right. We're supposed to be the power of examples, and we're not. We're mean to each other. We're the adults, as you said, and in the high halls of justice, our young people see bipartisanship in a way that's mean.
Right, and we're seeing more and more animosity toward people who are trying to do the right thing, and I think that's wrong. That's one of the big problems, because young people often do what they see, not what you tell them.
Absolutely,
they
they emulate.
should be doing.
They learn by example. They learn
Absolutely.
by example.
But you know, there's still hope, because we see a lot of panels going on these days. We see a lot of people getting together. We have a lot more multiracial people who are concerned about race and speaking from a perspective like the president. I mean, you know, which side is it they hate? Do they hate his black side or his white side when they're out there talking, you know, because he has both blood, you know, as many of us have. So we have to think about that.
Well, we're going to end this first segment on From Behind the Podium with Dr. Williams talking Ferguson, talking Eric Garner, and talking about race relations in our country. The next segment, when you watch From Behind the Podium, we're going to pick it back up, and we're going to focus more on the civil rights issues and how the church can become more involved in dealing with police and public relationships. This has been a great segment, and I look forward to having you back really soon.
Thank you.
God bless
you. So much.
It's great to see you. Stay tuned and tune back in to From Behind the Podium, conversations about law and faith. God bless you.